perception of Diana Ross is that she's a bitch. And she realizes that. She's very shrewd about her image. She knows people think that about her. It seems to me that Diana Ross would really like to be in a controlling position in her life. She wants to control the people with whom she comes in contact. And I think that that has to do with the fact that for 20-some years, she was very much controlled by Berry Gordy and Motown Records, so much so that after having sold many millions of records and after having made millions of dollars, she told me in 1981 that she wanted to buy a car, and she wasn't allowed to without Berry Gordy's signature. And to her, that was the final straw. She was finished with that end of her life. Now she controls people.
She said she wants a man to always understand, but that's all right for her.
She has what she calls standards, and most people call them rules and regulations, but she calls them standards. And one of those standards is that if you work for her, you should call her Miss Ross. She gets very angry if she's not. And she also does not like to be looked at in hallways. I thought that was very fascinating. When I was first a fan of the Supremes, I was 10 years old. And she was the ultimate woman for a 10-year-old. The older I got, and the more questions I began to ask, and the more I discovered about her, I think when you break into that facade, you're very surprised sometimes as to what you'll find in a celebrity. I'm not sure that I like her as much now as I did when I was 10, and that might have a lot to do with growing up.
My book, Earthly Remains, is about a group of archaeologists that go out into the Dead Sea area in 1948, and they find the remains of a corpse that they think could be Jesus Christ. This causes all kinds of problems. They're a group in the Catholic Church that regards this as a threat to the faith, and they take steps to eliminate this threat. I finished this book before the Rushdie affair occurred, and it really struck a responsive chord with me because I think it's the sort of thing that is existing in my novel. You've got a situation in which I am challenging in the book the uniqueness of Christ. Did he rise from the dead or didn't he? The book assumes that he did not, that his remains are found, and I think a large number of Catholics, Christians, might find that very troubling, very upsetting, very threatening. The New York Times liked my last book because of the excitement and the chaos and all the killing that occurred in the book. But I think this book, in many ways, is more compelling because it brings into doubt, challenges one of the most deeply held beliefs of millions of Christians, namely the resurrection. But I also think that it will bring you to a deeper understanding of that miracle and in many ways could strengthen your faith.
Freeing the Whales was one of the most remarkable media stories of the decade, I'm convinced, because it centered around a very natural, seemingly trivial happening, the stranding of 3 California gray whales in the Arctic Ocean north of Barrow, Alaska, the top of the world. It happens every year. They get stuck and stranded every year. But this year, since they were seen and spotted, it became a world media event of unparalleled proportions. The most remarkable thing about Freeing the Whales is that with the highest media concentration in the world in one of the tiniest and most remote villages in the world, we missed the whole story. We didn't even cover the story. The story of the Eskimos and their continuing struggle for survival, the story of how this wasn't a story at all. I mean, that's what's fascinating. The behind-the-scenes maneuverings, the superpower relations. The reason that I'm so excited about this book is because it's the story behind the story of how the world's greatest non-event became the subject of hundreds of millions of people's fascination around the world.
Why Why does Mary Jane Shady leave uncertain Texas and never return for 20 years? What happened to her that was so horrible, so awful, and so frightening that she didn't come back for 20 years? And why does she come back now? She comes back, she's rooked into it. She doesn't know exactly how she gets back. And that's part of what the reader gets to find out. How does she get back to this town? Well, we know that it's through her mother and Wyvon Henderson, who was her very best friend and has become the richest woman in town and also married her high school boyfriend. Well, what happened to Mary Jane Shady concerns this boyfriend. And that's one of the reasons why she's so upset that she ends back up in this little town. Coming back home, she faces her fears through her alter ego, Topsy Dingo Wild Dog. This part of her that's been repressed for 20 years. The spineless, frightened girl. And she's kept this repressed, and now that she's back, this part of her, Topsy Dingo Wild Dog, comes out. It's a book about her obsession. It's a book about facing your fears. And all these people are obsessed, but what she's obsessed with, what she has held on to, the thing that she's so frightened of in her catharsis, and I call this book a comedic exorcism of grief. Because what she finds is that what she was so scared of isn't what she was frightened of at all. It's something else. So there's a mystery. Topsy Dingo Wild Dog is a book that I wrote for myself. I wrote it so that I would stay out of the bars, off the streets, and out of the stores. It worked most of the time.
If you said to anybody, any football fan, what happened in January of 1969 and said 16-7, just without any other information, they would tell you that that was the day and that was the score of the game, that the New York Jets won Super Bowl III against the Baltimore Colts, which was probably the greatest upset in football history. That famous game has been the inspiration for my new book, The Game That Changed Pro Football. It's now 20 years since the Jets won that day, and football was never the same after they won. We went back and talked to a lot of the players and got new anecdotes and exciting stories about what actually took place that day. And anybody who reads the book that was at all interested in that game or in football in general has to be fascinated with the players talking about their most personal experiences and the things that game really meant to them. I asked a lot of the players if they felt, for instance, that they were immortal because the game is still talked about to such a great extent. And Pete Lamons, who was a tight end on the team, just said to me, and he's a Texan and he has this Texas accent, and sort of exaggerated his Texas drawl and said, well, dang, Steve, if we hadn't won that game, you wouldn't be talking to me right now. It wasn't only important for the players, it was important for all of pro football, because after the Jets won that game in January of 1969, the Super Bowl became the most important sporting event on a single day in America, almost to the extent of being a religious holiday with how people observe it. In 1969, there were about 20 million people who watched the Jets beat the Colts that day. Now there are over 100 million people who watch the game, and if this book sells about half that many, I'll be a very happy writer.
This book is a story about a Holocaust survivor, a beautiful young woman who comes to Israel in 1946 out of the ovens of Germany. And she meets a fellow whom she had known from the Nuremberg trials, who's an American lawyer. He comes to Israel, they get married. Soon, a Palestinian family enters the story. They don't get together, they're not friends, but they meet in a tragic episode in 1948. And the story follows the development of these two families Leah becomes a high official in the Israeli government. Nadia, the Arab woman, marries a man who, along with Yasser Arafat, sets up Fatah, the original terrorist organization, which became the major organization in the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO. It is the parallel development of the two stories, the Jewish family and the Arab or Palestinian family, that is what this book is about. It ends in 1982 with what I think is a note of hope for life.
If you want to give him the sandwich, give him the sandwich. If you don't want to give him the sandwich, don't. I don't want to give it. Well, then just eat the sandwich.
About 6-7 years ago, a movie came out called Diner. That was a great little movie, developed a great cult following. It was the first movie that Barry Levinson directed. Barry gave me a bit part in the movie. Later on, he was going to make Diner a TV series. It didn't pan out. A lot of the research I did to kind of work on that TV series has ended in this book. And what this book does, it talks about those of us who grew up in the 50s and 60s and what happened to those goals and aspirations that we all had. And that's what this book, Diner Guys, is about. It's not just guys, there are girls in it too, but we call them guys. Some of the people who came out of the diner became fairly famous. For example, there was a very fat, slovenly girl named Ellen Cohn. She later reinvented herself as Mama Cass Elliot of the pop group The Mamas and the Papas. Of course, Barry Levinson, who recently won the Academy Award for Rain Man, came out of the diner. I'll tell you a little story about Levinson. He finished last in our class. Here's a guy who's brilliant at writing dialogue, nominated for and wins Academy Awards. We had 460 people in our class. He finished last. Although some people might look at this as unique to Baltimore, it's not. It's unique to America. It's a slice of Americana. Everybody had a hangout where they grew up. Might have been a playground, might have been a deli, might have been a pool room, or it might have been a diner. On the West Coast, it was probably a drive-in. Whether you live in Spokane or Miami or New York or Tucson, you'll relate to this book.
I grew up in a town of about 800 people buried in the mountains, really buried in the mountains in southern Kentucky, and a town that was solidly Catholic, and where all of the people made our livings by servicing vice, basically, because the Catholics were the wild livers who sold liquor and made liquor, and people would come from the surrounding Protestant counties to sin, basically, and then they would go home and live decent lives. My mother was raised in a Baptist family and then converted to Catholicism to marry my father, which was something that, of course, her family was horrified at, and my father's family was horrified at. And it was a great story, you know. She was a great character and right there, and so it seemed logical to draw upon her. This is a story about a woman who is in the process of shaping the world in which she lives. She is a daring and courageous and smart and sharp woman, and she falls in love, she falls in lust, she gets married, and she finds that all of those qualities are, that they have to go away in order to live her married life. 25 years she does this. Then she decides that she is going to go back to the first person that she was trying to find in the first place, the woman for whom she's searching.
Qin, the first emperor of China, lived between 300 and 200 BC. He was probably one of the largest figures that has ever walked the earth in his exploits. He was a man who waged war on the 6 warring states who had been at war for 500 years, and within 20 years had consolidated and unified them in language, education, farming, armaments. He built the Great Wall of China at enormous cost, of course, and maybe some say as many as 700,000 people perished building it and are buried in the wall. He's a man whose legacy lives to this day. The book has come about as a result of a film being developed by the National Film Board of Canada, who have been in negotiation with the Chinese government for 7 years to make this film. It really is an outstanding thing or fact that the Chinese government, in reinterpreting their history of some 2,000 years ago, allow another country to do what is just short of an official interpretation of that period. The book, The First Emperor of China, is really an illustrated biography of the man. It certainly captures a lot of the activity of the film and the exploits of the man. It also, for the first time, is beautifully illustrated with many of the artifacts that the Chinese government have released for the book and the film. It will be the first time that many people have seen any of this. Most of the world has seen any of it.
This book, How Many Words Do You Want?, is an examination of the similarities and differences between the journalism of print and TV news, not through any scholarly or statistical study, but through the experiences of a working lifetime in those jobs. I was lucky enough to spend my working life working in journalism, about half of it in non-newspapers all over the country, in magazines, the rest in television news, which is wonderful. 1945 was the greatest news year in my long and misspent life. I was in Paris making up the Paris Herald Tribune, which was only 4 pages then. Franklin D. Roosevelt died. The war ended in Europe. They dropped the atomic bomb, and the war ended in Japan, all of which represents, in our time, I think, the greatest series of events so far. In television, I started out producing a half-hour Sunday evening news show in 1954, and then went on to some very big events that occurred at that time, like the Hungarian Revolution, which was made for television. After that, we got involved in various major stories, like the assassination of Kennedy, and on into the Vietnam War. Being in the news business is the greatest thing that can happen to any person. I am enormously lucky that I had such a long and pleasant career in it, which led me around the world repeatedly.
My book is called Daughters of Captain Cook because when Captain Cook arrived in Hawaii, really all hell broke loose. He was considered by the Hawaiians to be the god Lono. Having discovered them, he fell into this myth himself and allowed himself to be treated as a god. The theme of my book has to do, I think, with mythical and realistic culture merging. The protagonist, whose name is Jesse Quill, leaves Kansas at the age of 18 with a dashing young man and goes to Hawaii, where he's been raised, and finds there a completely different world, a completely different culture, a place where people have beliefs that are astonishing to her. Jesse's husband, Paul, falls in love with Maya, who is not just a 14-year-old girl, that in itself being shocking and upsetting, of course, but also is his half-sister. What happens as I write it is that I find that all women, in fact, have something in common, whether they are part of this traditional culture or whether part of the new modern age, that we all, in fact, are the inheritors of a certain past. And we've been affected by many of the same things, although we deal with them in different ways. It's a distressing ending, I hope, but that's what happens.
I had the job that any writer would have loved to have had. It allowed me to go anywhere in the world, to satisfy my curiosity about things that intrigue me, to have all my expenses paid, and to make a fine living by doing so. My book is called Distant Secrets, but I think the subtitle explains it better. It's called Unraveling the Mysteries of Our Ancient Past. And it deals with some of the most important archaeological discoveries of recent years on every continent and in a great many countries. And I visited every one of them in person. I was shot at in Lebanon during the Civil War. I found myself 8 stories below ground in an underground city in Turkey when my flashlight went out and I didn't know my way out. I stepped on a rotten stone step, should be rotten because it's 2,000 years old, in a pyramid in Tikal in Guatemala, and it gave way between my feet and I would have fallen to my death unquestionably. Fortunately, there was a root of a tree growing up beside the stairs, and I grabbed onto that when I recovered my footing. But outside of that, I haven't suffered any real mishaps. What I've tried to do was to take the reader along with me to share the adventure so that he sees things the way I see them and has the same surprises, the same fears, the same concerns, and the same satisfactions that I had in researching and writing these stories.
George Will, I think, had a good commentary that really defines it. He said, if Abraham Lincoln were alive today, what sound bites have gone from 45 seconds down to 9 seconds to get your point across, which we have to do here right now. So he said, if Abraham Lincoln were alive today, he would say, read my lips, no more slavery. So what the unreality industry is about, it's not just the book on media, although it deals with media. It's not just the book on TV, although it deals with TV. It's the manufacturing of images, the manufacturing of people. They're all pseudo-creations. Is that what we've come to as a society? Everything is a 9-second soundbite. So what the unrealities industry is about, how we manufacture. What are the varieties by which we manufacture people? Stuff we're talking about has been so internalized, it's so invisible, no one sees there's a problem, right? What are you going to do, outlaw the media? Prime feature of unreality is you caricature, that we become a parody of our own parodies. We have to caricature every issue that we deal with. It's got to be entertaining. It's got to be entertaining, entertaining, entertaining. It's got to be entertaining.
A Case of Innocence is a detective mystery novel, one in the traditional genre of the Sam Spade type mysteries. We all know that first novels are never autobiographical, but the protagonist in this novel, like myself, is an attorney practicing law in Wichita, Kansas. The story takes place in Wichita and is centered around the Kansas locale. The basic storyline is that James P. Casey, the attorney/detective in this story, is hired by a client whose daughter has been kidnapped by drug dealers. The drug dealers are holding the daughter to exert some pressure on the wife, whom they think knows the location of a catch of drugs that her husband, her drug dealer husband, has been hiding from them. Casey thinks he's finally got the mystery solved, and he's kidnapped the girl back from the kidnappers and brings her back to Wichita. And the ending has kind of a double twist on him, which surprises him as well, but I'll leave that for you to read in the book.
Corporate Bloodlines, The Future of the Family Firm, is fascinating because it talks about it's a real peek at the lives of 14 families and their businesses. And we were actually permitted to come into their lives. With some families, we stayed with them for 4 days, and we learned everything about them. And the fact that often the family, the culture, the heritage, and the religion really forms the kind of business it is.
We decided that there had to be common threads in running a family business, whether it be how to resolve sibling rivalry that often exists, how to pass on the business to the next generation. And we decided that the best way to find these threads would be to write a whole number of families, and hopefully that enough of them would want to be interviewed for the book.
Family is resist change. Family is a constant. Family is sort of inward. Business is dynamic, changing, sort of an outward thing. You know, you go out and you greet your customers.
And you reward for competence, not because you were born with the right genes.
Good point. Right, good point. And these two systems tend to clash. And when they overlap, you're going to have an unhealthy family business, and you're going to have one with problems and one that ultimately will probably fail.
I was working for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and was assigned the story of writing about Charles Hatcher, a serial killer who had said he killed 16 people. And I was brought into it because an innocent man had been put in prison for one of Hatcher's murders. Charles Hatcher roamed the nation's landscape like a lost nomad, and he was pursued by an impulse to kill. And when this impulse overtook him, he always left a victim in his wake. Many murders that are committed are murders that take place between people who know one another, or there is a motive involved, a robbery. But in Charles Hatcher's case, there were only victims of opportunity. As he said to an FBI agent once, whoever was around was in trouble. St. Joseph's Children is a unique book because I was able to use things most writers don't have the advantage of having. Things like an interview of a psychopathic killer receiving a true serum, sodium amytal, and talking about what's going through his mind as he pursues a murder victim. There's an example of a witness being hypnotized and testifying as to what he sees as a little boy is being led off to his death. What did I think about him? I think he was a killer. And I hated the things he did. I can't say that he's a person that when he was buried, no one was there except fellow inmates. He died with no one caring about him. He's just a lost soul.
Well, as a parent of a 7-year-old, I can tell you that I'm an expert, that children do ask a lot of questions. And they ask the whos and the whys and the hows and the wheres, but the whys are really the most important. And some of them are easy. Why is the sky blue? Personally, I don't know, but Mr. Wizard does. You just put them down in front of the TV and Mr. Wizard will tell them why the sky is blue. But when it comes to questions about their physical and emotional well-being, parents don't want to make mistakes. They don't want some flip answer that will leave the child wondering. And that's what this series is all about. It's to help the parent give answers to questions like, where did I come from? Why was I adopted? Why do I have to go to the hospital? And in my case, why do I have to wear glasses? This book answers those questions in a way that's both, one, humorous, so the child doesn't lose interest, and two, non-condescending. I mean, having the 7-year-old, I've read a lot of children's books, and the ones I hate the most are the ones that are so saccharine that you go instantly into diabetic coma, or the ones where you want to say to the author, it's a child, but he's not brain dead. Arthur Robbins, who did the illustrations for Where Did I Come From, we were lucky enough to get him for Why Do I Have to Wear Glasses? And this sends people, his pictures send people into giggle fits. They're so great, and children love them, and parents enjoy them too.
If you're wondering why I'm not wearing glasses now, it's because you're close enough to me I can see you. But if you ever get in a car with me, make sure I have my glasses on.
You Ain't Heard Nothing Yet comes from Al Jolson's very first lines ever spoken in the talkies, the second reel of The Jazz Singer in 1927. He comes up and he goes, wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet. How would you like to hear Toot Toot Tootsie? And that was the beginning of talkies. This book has 501 famous lines from great and not so great movies. It also tries to clear up a few of the non-quotes that exist, like Cary Grant, Judy, Judy, Judy. He never said, much to my disappointment when I started researching this. The book is not a book of misquotes, it's a book of correct quotes. Though as you go through it, you will find to your surprise often that you had the line slightly off, but they're all great lines, and everything from contemporary films, Fish Called Wanda with Kevin Kline, Don't Call Me Stupid, which he says about 10 times in movies, that movie. Clint Eastwood, Go Ahead Punk, Make My Day. The book goes up to the present day, films, and Glenn Close's devastating remark to Michael Douglas, where she says, I will not be ignored. Well, I'm hopeful that You Ain't Heard Nothing Yet will not be ignored by the public when they get their hands on
I wrote the book because I felt there was a need for a book that would explain the differences between British and American English. Although we speak the same language, quite often we mean different things by the same words. For example, an Englishman might ask his friend, his American friend, to pour out the coffee, and the American would pour the coffee into the sink. The British man would then say, where's the coffee? And the American would say, you said to pour it out. And the British man would then be quite justified in saying, you bloody fool, I didn't tell you to pour it away. And for another example, an American girl might invite a British girlfriend to go to Brighton with her for the weekend. In this case, she would say, you wouldn't have to spend a penny. And the English girl, horrified, would say, spend a penny? What do you mean? Because to her, to spend a penny means to go to the bathroom.
More films of the 30s. This is a sequel to a book I did for Citadel Press. This is part of the Citadel Press series, The Films Of. I did a book for them 7 years ago called The Films of the 30s, which was very popular and sold very well. It covered 100 films. This book will cover another 100 films. It will encompass some of the important ones left out in the first book, for which one critic called me on the carpet, how come these are missing? In my opinion, the 30s was a fascinating decade. We don't have anything like this anymore. One illustration, the movie Cleopatra, which Cecil B. DeMille, the great showman, made with Claudette Colbert as Cleopatra. And DeMille found out that she was deathly afraid of snakes, and as most people know, Cleopatra used a snake to commit suicide at the end of the story. So DeMille was smart enough to shoot the whole movie with leaving that scene for last, and he got all her footage in the can, and then he brought out this large boa constrictor and scared the hell out of her, and she said, oh, Mr. DeMille, take that thing away from me. And he said, he got rid of it, and he brought out this little 6-inch garden snake, and he says, well, how about this? And she says, oh, the poor little thing, give him to me. And she did the scene right through with no problem, and they got the movie in the can. And that shows how smart a director-producer Mr. DeMille was.
The hero. You touch White Buffalo again and I'll kill you. I grew up in the wilds of New Jersey, and ever since I was a child, I fantasized about living the life of John Wayne, action and adventure.
Fill your hand, you son of a bitch!
I guess my way of fulfilling that fantasy is ultimately resulted in writing this book, the John Wayne Scrapbook. I guess where this differs from most of the books written about Wayne is that its contents makes it rather unique. In addition to examining each of his classic films in detail, the stories behind how it was made and its results with the critics and at the box office, our book also features a section which has various bloopers that Wayne made in his career, whether it was a film or mistakes on his advertising posters and things like that. What people admired about Wayne was, even if they didn't agree with him politically or socially on the issues, they respected him because he said what was on his mind, you knew where he stood, and he wasn't apologetic about it. The image he projected was that of the American hero, and whether he was himself or not a hero, his image was more important than what he was himself.
It's a heck of an explosive story.